Chairman, I move that the question be now put.
I think I'll hear the Honourable Pete Hodson.
I want to begin by congratulating the two members of the ACT Party for remaining true to their neoliberal origins, something that the other three members haven't, or at least 2.5 of them haven't. But as is the case with the ACT Party, when it does remain true to its neoliberal origins and becomes consistent, it's also within the bounds of possibility that it is consistently wrong. Society ranges itself variously, either collectively or individually. You could call it user pays or payer use. You could call it public sector or private sector. All economies are mixed. All economies are mixed. And they always will be. It's always better to have a pay-a-use society to deliver health services, for example, and a user-pay society to deliver whatever it might be, fruit and vegetable services, is always going to be mixed. And students' associations are themselves economies that are mixed. They provide their pastoral services, their welfare services, and most but not all of their health services on a pay-a-use model. On the other hand, their media, for example, radio or print media, advertising, is on a user pay, and they charge like wounded bulls. So students' associations have a mixture of the way in which they build their revenue base. And the reason they have a mixture is that it's sometimes more efficient to use user pay, and it's sometimes more efficient to have pay-a-use. And if you get rid of pay-a-use, you end up with less efficiency, and you end up with a lower delivery of some things that students have erstwhile considered important, including welfare, pastoral or health services. Now, of course, some of the services such as agitation or advocacy or whatever also come from the student fees, and that may be something that the ACT Party would like to raise in support of their position. But the truth of the matter is that the vast bulk of the revenue that is collected by students for students' associations is spent collectively on things that students in general over the years have found useful. How do I know this? Well, because for 20 years I've been the member for Dunedin North. My electorate office is next door to the Captain Cook pub. There is not a week in the academic year that goes by when there aren't students in my office seeing me and my staff over something, and that's been going on for 20 years. There's now 19,000 of them washing through the place every 3 or 4 years. It's like a transit camp. And in that time, in those 2 decades, not one student has darkened my door in favour of this legislation. Not one. Not one student has darkened my door in favour of this legislation, and yet we say that we're a democracy. We say that we are a democracy. We say that the majority can have, are entitled to have the sway, except in this instance, where we've got a 3.5% party having its way with a party that's supposed to be principled to overturn something that no student in my electorate over 20 years has ever asked for. And that's outrageous. It's outrageous because ACT says they know best. They are not part of this debate. They are not at university as far as I'm aware. I was at university last year and I had to pay student fees to Victoria University and did not use the services. That's what happens with pay-a-use. Sometimes I don't use the health services in this country either, even though I seem to be paying tax. It's still the most efficient way to run those services. And yet ideology is being rammed through and skewering common sense, and as my colleague Marion Street points out, the National Party sits there and says diddly squat. They know in their hearts that it's a bit awkward. They know in their hearts that back at their pollies, but especially at their universities, they're going to have to face some difficult questions. They know there's going to be destruction of services, but they sit there because somewhere, at some stage, there needed to be some trade-off to make sure that that coalition partner of this ill-begotten government was going to be getting its jollies over this legislation. Not a good way to run a country. Not principled, not called for, not democratic, not popular, wrong.
I call Tim McIndoe.
I move that the question be now put.
I call David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to start by just addressing one or two of the things that Heather Roy mentioned when she made her address just before. She said, first of all, that you don't have to have a student association to be effective. And she gave the example of the Christchurch earthquake. Now, I'm not sure if that's true or not, what she said there. I seem to think that a student association had some greater role than what she was talking about. But somehow you don't need a student association to be mobilised and to be effective. If that's the case, Heather Roy, why is it that the student body can't mobilise 10%? To be able to actually come up with the numbers and to force through a referendum? Why isn't that possible? Because it doesn't seem, on the one hand, that you don't need a student association to be effective, but on the other hand, it can never be effective enough to get that requisite 10% up. She also talked about the idea that a student association, or a union as they prefer to call it, is one of the only organisations left in this country that is compulsory, where you have to pay a compulsory fee. I think this is a wrong characterisation of what a student association is. And David Cagle and his son made an extremely good presentation to the Select Committee where they argued that this was more of akin to a tax, not a union, in the sense that people who belong to, for example, a council pay their rates. They pay for things that they may not use, but they pay for the fact of a greater good. It's only compulsory if students don't want to force a referendum through, but they are paying for something which people overwhelmingly get great benefit from. And I think that's the crux of this argument in Clause 6, Mr. Chair. And I come back to the point that, in fact, and again, Heather Roy talked disparagingly about Grant Robinson's SOPs, but in fact, many of those SOPs were an attempt by this side to come to some sort of compromise so that this would be a palatable piece of legislation, that this might have some endurance out there rather than come November 26 it being targeted for elimination. This could have actually been a better piece of legislation that might have had the agreement of all sides of the House. Because she's absolutely wrong about and here are the facts, Mr. Chair. Here are the facts that if you bring in this piece of legislation, the student associations will wither considerably or will disappear. That is the fact. That is based on evidence. That is based on the experience of Australia, and the Australian experience. What happened? Their membership dropped horrendously. And let me give you the statistics that came from the Australian Student Association, which actually came before the Select Committee by phone. They said the associations have effectively collapsed or drastically reduced their services and implemented user pays in many areas, and has disadvantaged many of the students, particularly those from low socioeconomic areas. That the tertiary institutions have taken over services and assets previously owned by students. And here's the other thing about when that happened. They in fact began charging levies for reduced services more money than the students were paying to begin with. Look, for most of the students' associations that I look at, the Unitec one, we're looking at about $120. Now, $120 for many is a substantial amount of money, but the services you get from that amount of money is way beyond way beyond what a tertiary institution would be able to charge and be able to provide. And the secret is because the student associations have the student membership, the army of volunteers that come around the student association, and all of that, Mr. Chair, all of that will disappear when this piece of legislation makes it through Parliament. Mr. Chair, we looked at, and I refer back to Grant Robertson's SOP 229A. He's calling there for a nationwide referendum. I mean, Mr. Chair.
I call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.